Welcome to the Duckpin Podcast with your host, Brian Griffiths. And now, here's Brian.
Hi, everybody. Brian Griffiths here, the publisher of the Duckpin. Before we get into this week's episode, I just wanted to make sure I wish you all a happy new year. Thank you for making the Duckpin a place where you get information, watching our shows, listening to our podcasts, and reading us over at theduckpin.com. I do want to ask you, please invite your friends, family, neighbors, coworkers, co-religionists, in-laws, and outlaws to follow us over at theduckpin.com, to like us on social media. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/theduckpin. We are on Twitter at theduckpin. We are on Instagram at theduckpin. And of course, you can also follow us and subscribe to us on YouTube as well. So if you have not done that yourself already, please do so. And please invite a couple of your friends and family members to follow us on those social media platforms as well. And now we bring you this week's episode of the Duckpin Podcast. As we close out 2020, of course, one of the things that fortunately has, for the most part, survived in 2020 has been bowl season. And to talk about the upcoming college football playoff, I'm joined today by the Duckpin's College Football Analyst, Justin Reedy. Justin, thanks for joining us this week.
Great to be on with you, Brian.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Now, obviously, before we get too far down the road and talk about the fun stuff, let's kind of veer over to your day job for just a second. As many of you know, a state senator representing Maryland's 5th District. Last week, an institution, Senate President Mike Miller, former Senate President Mike Miller, retired after 50 years of legislative service in Annapolis. And though obviously Senator Miller was a Democrat, you're a Republican, but just wanted to kind of get some thoughts from you about Senator Miller's retirement.
Yeah, well, I tell you, I mean, 50 years of service. Mike Miller was Senate President for 30 now, the 30 something years now. The years escape me because last year he was not. He had stepped down from being Senate President, and he was a nemesis for us as Republicans often at times. Although one of the things that I did see serving in the Senate was that there were times you could work with him on issues too. He was not, in a strange way, he was very partisan, but not as rigidly ideologically left. So he seemed to understand that his party went too far sometimes and would try to, he was still certainly to the left of me by a pretty good margin. But there were times we could work with him on things as I served in the Senate, because unfortunately the Senate and the House of Delegates have both moved further left ideologically in the past few election cycles. Obviously, of course, he was an opponent on a number of issues, though, and we had a lot of battles. But I think his health has continued to be very difficult for him, and certainly wish him all the best. And it's an end of a long era. And even though I don't necessarily believe people should stay in an office for a long time, I know the discussion in your previous life on Red Maryland about term limits and things like that. I think there is something to be said for somebody who really dedicated a lot of their time in their life to trying to serve in the best way they knew how. And it will not be the same, certainly without him. He was had amazing historical knowledge of not just of his time there, but of the entire history of the state of Maryland. So that alone, I think, will certainly be missed.
Yeah, hear on that. And certainly we're praying for Senator Miller's health and for his family at this time as well. Let's go ahead and start talking a little about the fun stuff. Obviously, this week, college football playoff starts. For those of you who might have been living under a rock, the top team in the country, Alabama. Spoiler alert: Justin's top team, also in life, his beloved Crimson Tide, will take on number 4 Notre Dame. Number 2 Clemson will take on number 3 Ohio State. Before we start breaking down the matchups a little bit, let's talk a little bit about how we got here, because I think this year, more than any other year since the institution of the college football playoff, we have seen a lot of controversy surrounding what teams got into the playoff. I think there's a general consensus that Alabama is the number 1 team in the country. I don't think you're going to see a lot of argument from anybody there. Clemson, I think, is a consensus number 2 team. You're not going to see an argument from anybody there. Their one loss was to another team in the playoff. Notre Dame, obviously, another team whose only loss was to a team in the playoff.
And they were missing their quarterback at the time at that game. So
right, exactly. The soon to be Jacksonville Jaguar, Trevor Lawrence.
Yes.
It's kind of where we get to number 3 and number 4. I think there's a lot of questions. The Big Ten changed their rules to get Ohio State into their title game.
They changed their arbitrary rules that they created at the start of the season, which didn't make a whole lot of sense when they made them. But yes, that's correct.
Yeah, we could do an entire show on how goofy the Big Ten was with their decision-making process this year.
Yeah.
But they only played 6 games. Notre Dame gets in with 1 loss. And I just want to kind of get your thoughts on this. I know that you wrote over at the Duckpin that you thought Texas A&M was a better team than Notre Dame and probably should have made the playoffs. Certainly, an argument can be made there. There are other teams lurking around there, an undefeated Cincinnati team, who hasn't gotten a lot of opportunities this year. So let's just kind of take a look at just how we got here. And as it relates to number 3 and number 4, do you think the committee got it right?
As you pointed out, I talked about Texas A&M. I thought deserved more than Notre Dame, only because Notre Dame, at the end of the year was blown out by Clemson in the championship game. They only beat Clemson in double overtime at home when Clemson was missing their quarterback. I wasn't surprised that Notre Dame was. I think Notre Dame and Texas A&M on a neutral site would be an extremely close game. I think A&M was probably more quote unquote deserving. They were also hurt by Florida losing to LSU late in the season and then losing to Alabama because that was one of their big wins. That could be my SEC homer bias showing a little bit, but I think A&M and Notre Dame probably you could flip a coin on. I think the committee didn't want to see A&M get a rematch with Alabama when they had lost big to them, but it was early in the year. Cincinnati, in my mind, had a decent argument. They were hurt this year by not really being able, because most conferences didn't do any out-of-conference playing. They didn't get the chance to go play and beat a Big Ten team or an ACC team to show that, or a couple of Power 5 teams. So I don't think Cincinnati, and I think they were also hurt by the fact that their championship game, they barely beat a pretty good Tulsa team, but they barely beat them in a big rainstorm. They just didn't look dominant in that game. I don't think that's completely fair because they actually were – the AAC that they play in, the American Athletic Conference, is the best non-Power 5 conference, and they really dominated that conference this year. And really for 2 years they've been excellent. I don't think they were going to give Alabama a better game. They'd have been the 4th seed. I don't think they would have given Alabama a better game than Notre Dame or Texas A&M. We do need to figure out, and I've written, of course, about it at the Duckpin. We do need to figure out, I think, something for the playoff. I don't think going to 8 teams is the answer because we barely had 2 teams this year. Alabama and Clemson are the 2 best teams. They're the best. They're the best talent on the field. They were the best. I do believe if Trevor Lawrence had played that first game against Notre Dame, Clemson would have been undefeated. I actually think you could make a big argument for Clemson being the number 1 team in the country. I think if Alabama had not lost Jalen Waddle, their star receiver, that I would be picking them to win for sure because I think they could outscore anybody. I still think I still give them a little better than 50-50 against Clemson, but it's close, and I think they could very well lose. But with Jalen Waddle, there's no way you can cover Waddle and Devontae Smith and Najee Harris. There's just no way you can stop them. Alabama's now got that Waddle injury. He may play in the championship game, but I think it's unlikely, and they lost their center. So it'll be very interesting between those 2 teams. Ohio State, I actually think has a similar level of elite talent, but had Notre Dame and Clemson I could have made an argument for leaving them out and putting A&M and Notre Dame in. That's what I'm trying to say. Mm-hmm. I could have made an argument for that. I think that was never going to happen as long as they were undefeated and 6-0 because they bring tons of eyeballs. And Notre Dame had the advantage over Texas A&M and Cincinnati of being a bigger name brand program. Certainly Texas A&M has a good tradition, but it's just not the same. So we got to the point where Notre Dame only had 1 loss, a bad loss, but it was to one of the 2 best teams in the country after beating them once. And we had an undefeated Ohio State team that struggled at times in their 6 games. They basically had a bye week after every game. So to me, it's not really necessarily quote unquote fair, but it isn't like there's another team out there other than maybe Texas A&M or Cincinnati that says we deserve it more. And Ohio State in the eyeball test is probably one of the best. I actually think Ohio State Clemson will be a good game. I think Alabama is going to blow out Notre Dame. I don't think it's going to be like a 40-point blowout, but I think the spread on that is, I think, 17 or 18. I would expect Alabama to win by probably 21. I think a game could be close for a half, and then Alabama pulls away. But Clemson, Ohio State, I think could be closer. We'll have to see. How we got here was the way we got here by a sort of a very strange. Some conferences started playing weeks later than others. I'm thankful we had a season. I'm thankful that the Big Ten's plan to try to make everybody take the year off didn't work. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, it's definitely been, it's going to be interesting. I don't think like I said, I think the Alabama Notre Dame game will probably not end up competitive. I think Clemson Ohio State could be a tighter game.
Well, let's talk. There's a lot to break down there, so let's kind of go back. You had talked about you had posted your plan. You had written about it at the Duckpin.com. About how doing a +1 or a +4, basically kind of playoff to keep the bowl season, the traditional bowl season, the way it was before the playoff, and then moving into either a +1 playoff or a 4-team playoff after that. I have been talking all season about a 16-team playoff, moving straight to like the 1AA model, which would have given, it would have given the Cincinnatis and the Coastals and a chance. Do you think either of those would either of those have provided a result that would have made people happier than what we've got now? I think it's probably the question I was going to ask, because there's just so many people who are, Coastal was mad, they didn't get a shot. Now, of course, they went out and lost the Cure Bowl in a really weird game to Liberty.
To a very good Liberty team. I mean, that was
ironically a team they were supposed to play originally, and then that's when they got their signature win against BYU as a replacement. And I think that BYU doesn't get enough credit for taking that game on 3 days' notice.
Yeah, that's right.
2 time zones away. I guess the question is, how do we get to that happy place?
Well, number one, first of all, for the listeners that aren't huge college football fans, first of all, what are you waiting for? It's a great sport. It's amazing.
Maybe they're all Maryland fans like me,
Well, I know it's see, and Brian, one of the reasons I wanted to start writing about college football, I tried, what's my point of view? What's my perspective? Because you can go to anywhere and get breakdowns of, what games, what's picks against the spread. And I may do some of that from time to time. But, I feel like I want to convey the joy that comes with the nostalgic joy that I have about college football. And I started my life in the Deep South in a college football extended family, and then came to Maryland as a kid. And there's not a tradition of college football being a huge passion. Maryland has had some good teams. Obviously, where I live, there's a lot of Penn State fans too. But it's not the same year in, year out, day after day like it is in the Deep South, where you live and die with how your team recruits and all that. And so we're more of a pro sports area, which I love. I love professional football too, but we're more of a pro sports area. So I try to get across how great it is. One of the things that confounds people all the time is they don't understand the bowls. They're like, why is there this stupid such and such.com bowl? Well, over the years, we started out with just a handful of bowls back. There were exhibitions after the season was over in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And over time, the bowls grew to have more and more games, and they're not officially run by the NCAA. So it's always this weird, it's like college football outsources their national championship to bowl games. So they're literally paying people money that they could just keep all the money themselves, which is an interesting argument for why they ought to just take over a whole playoff system. But what bowls do allow is for teams, I actually think we might be getting to the point where we have too many. I used to argue we didn't have too many. We're up to like 40 now. Because the NCAA
before I think it was before some of these games got canceled, the original lineup I think was 41 or 42. Yeah.
Which
I love the people of Boston, but I don't know who wants to fly there to play a postseason game between 2 6 and 5 teams in December.
And not to get too much into the weeds, but basically the NCAA will allow you to do a bowl game if you have a TV partner and a sponsor. Like, it's not like you have to a team has to get to 6 wins normally, not this year because of the weird stuff, but normally a team has to get to 6 wins to be eligible out of 12 games played. So a lot of teams can schedule their way into a bowl if they're smart enough. I think we're probably at 40 or 41 too many. Well, with 25 to 30, I don't think it's too many because we got about 130 college football Division I teams. There's so many bowls partly because it lets minor conferences have bowls too. It used to be only big conferences could get into the 15 or 17 bowl games.
Yeah, I remember when I was a kid watching, talking about the early 90s, it was like the only time, the MAC and the was it the MAC and the WAC at the time, or was the MAC and the Big West at the time?
The Big West
team only got one game in, and it was always the California Raisin Bowl for all those years, which wasn't even on network television. I remember it being on like syndicated television.
Yeah, it was like Raycom would televise it. Las Vegas, and then they created the Las Vegas Bowl. And then there was a couple of other bowls, but then over time we got up to where there were all these bowls. Mm-hmm. I love the bowls. I think that part of when you understand that what a bowl allows a team to do, it really for Maryland to for example, to build a successful program long term. No, but so many times I watch Twitter when Maryland's playing, and people comment on Loxley and Twitter and Maryland like it's a pro team, like these guys are just trash. And you're like, well, it's going to take more than a year or two to get Maryland to a place. I don't know if Loxley's the right guy or not. He recruits well. But getting into a bowl means you get normally, not this year's weird because of the timeline too, but normally what it means is you get about 12 to 15 extra practices. So you can practice more with your team. And football is a sport that has to be practiced extensively you can let younger players get time before a bowl game. It gives you more exposure on television, even in a minor bowl. People say, oh, these bowls are stupid. Look, ESPN, they put a bowl game on, they get 1 million people watching. It's more than they're going to get for a college basketball game or for anything else or some stupid debate show. So, anyway, I love the bowls, generally speaking. I wouldn't mind if maybe we had a few fewer than we do now, but I love the bowls. And what I would love to see is instead of trying to get to 8 teams or 16 teams, my perspective is right now, if you had an 18 playoff, Alabama's getting in every year. Or Alabama or LSU, one of the SEC West teams will get in every year because there'll be at least one SEC West team that didn't win their division but is good enough to play. And so you're going to end up with a situation where you're still not going to have the parity you want. I do get the argument more people would get a shot, but when I was coming up, and I think Brian, when you were coming up as kids, January 1st was this magical day where there were a whole bunch of bowl games going on all at once. And some years there was a 1 versus 2 matchup, but most years there was like a 1 versus 4 and a 2 versus 5 and a 3 versus 11. And, these weird connections of these bowls because the conferences were tied into a certain bowl game usually, or a couple of bowl games. And so you'd have this situation where you could walk in and be like, if the number 1 team wins, they'll be the national champion. But if they don't win, that there could be another team that gets it. What I'd love to see is us go back to where conferences basically are tied into a New Year's Six bowl, including giving a couple of spots to the G5, not just one spot in the New Year's Six, but a couple of spots. So you could get a Coastal and a Cincinnati, or a BYU and a Cincinnati, or whatever, or UCF. And then if they win their bowl game over a good opponent, well, they have a chance at being in that top 4. It'd probably have to be a 4 after that, a Final 4 after that. And then you remove because right now what happens is they start the rankings for the playoff in the middle of the season, and they kind of pigeonhole teams, and they don't ever really see a head-to-head. So anyway, that's my philosophy on the playoff. I think it could reinvigorate the bowls and I don't want to, though, also see the minor bowls go away. I think it gives a whole bunch of teams a chance to end the season with a win. In the NFL, only one team ends their season with a win.
Right.
And that's fine because it's professional. But just imagine on New Year's Day or January 1 and January 2, it'd be like watching the final day of the NFL season where they have like 4 games or 5 games going at once. And everybody's watching all these games to see who's going to get the wild card. I mean, today was a great day of games in the NFL because you had all these machinations of who's going to do what. That was what college football often was like on January 1st, on New Year's Day.
Yeah, I remember that it was the year, particularly like 98, I think it was. It was the year Washington and Tennessee and Nebraska was involved. I mean, there was
they were all playing in conference championships, but it's that concept that they're all playing at once. And actually, conference championship day right now can be like that in college football, but it'd be on steroids. In 1991 And in 1990, both, you had all these games happening at one time and it ended up with a split national champion both times, which wouldn't be possible today. And that you said to me,
UCF would like to have a word about that.
Yeah. Well, you say to me, where are we going to get to a happy place? That was a great question. We probably won't ever get to a happy place, but one of the things that makes college football so great is that that's what makes it great, is that you can debate endlessly. What I think would be cool, though, is you'd still have debate. No matter what you do, there will be a debate over who got left out. Maybe your 16-team thing might not, because then you'd have you really can't complain if you're the 17th team and didn't get in.
Right.
But I think that may not be practical for other reasons. So I don't know. I don't know that my idea they'll ever do either, but it would be great to have like a +1 or a +2 kind of setup.
Well, let's talk about, one of the things that proposals that came out recently, and I think it was from the NCAA or one of their commissions, was that they were just going to completely basically divest FBS football out of the NCAA structure entirely, which always seemed just kind of weird to me, where the NCAA is basically like, we're just going to be done with this entire thing. What are your thoughts on that, and kind of how that fits into the bowl or playoff picture, going forward?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of people go, when they people who don't follow college football much, they assume there's like one person in charge, and there's not. Every conference has its own power structure, and they don't necessarily want to help other conferences necessarily. I mean, sometimes they'll work together, but not always. The NCAA doesn't run the bowls. The NCAA doesn't declare the national champion. That's different in basketball. In both women's and men's college basketball, the NCAA runs the tournament and makes money from the tournament and crowns the champion. But the NCAA does not recognize, they end up recognizing the national champion, but they're not the ones who pick it. Like they just say, well, we're taking the winner of the playoff is the NCAA national champion. I think the idea of getting it more out from under the NCAA has merit, because I think you're going to get to a point where we have to figure out how to compensate players. And we got name, image, and likeness percolating. I'm a strong supporter of that. I'm not a huge fan necessarily of making them paid employees, because I think that denotes something different. But allowing them to profit off their name, image, and likeness and get a stipend of some kind, which players actually already get a cost of attendance stipend. But for what we put college football players through, and frankly, even college basketball players through, and they're the revenue sports, I think the idea of getting football out from under the NCAA would be like, look, the NCAA, there's all these rules we have to follow, and that's because we don't have anybody else that can enforce rules, but the NCAA is terrible at it. And I have a feeling the NCAA wouldn't necessarily mind not having to try to enforce who's getting $100 handshakes in a parking lot. So it's an interesting idea. I do think the way the college football system is set up right now, it's like the worst possible setup, except for all the rest. Like, it's the old joke about democracy or whatever it is. It's the worst form of government except for all the rest. I don't know that just going away from the NCAA as a covering, that there's going to be problems with that too. But it is interesting for people who know, if they hear about people talking about getting out of the NCAA does not run the college football national championship. They don't run the bowls. They regulate what the programs do, but they don't run the bowls. So it's a very weird setup for people who are like NFL fans that are used to the Shield and Roger Goodell saying, "So let it be written, so let it be done," and all the owners marching in lockstep. That's not how it works in college football. And you could see it, frankly, with how the Big Ten tried to basically shame all the other conferences into not playing, and the SEC and the ACC are like, screw you, pal. So it was, yeah. What would have been great is probably all five of them get together and come up with a plan, but the five power conferences, but they just couldn't do it.
Let's get back to a little bit to the games themselves. You've already kind of made a prediction that Alabama, it will, for lack of a better term, smoke Notre Dame. Clemson, I think, Clemson, Ohio State. It seems like you're kind of leaning towards Clemson in that game. And that would bring us to another Alabama, Clemson national championship game. What do you think that does kind of for the sport of college football, where you're going to wind up in a situation where you have the two top teams, which are clearly better than the rest?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no doubt that
especially if Clemson beats Ohio State, I think that would make it clear that those two are the best. Yeah.
Yeah, there is no doubt that Alabama and Clemson are number 1 and number 2 right now. And there's no doubt, I think, amongst fans, that when you talk about the top programs in college football, that Clemson and Alabama are 1 and 1A, and you can argue about who's which one at any particular given moment in time. Do you think that that's ultimately good, though, for the sport to have a situation where you have basically the same two teams, the same two programs, the same two systems facing off year after year, in the championship game? I mean, obviously, when you look at a sport like college basketball, you've got Carolina and Duke, or Duke and Kansas, or, some of these regional or, intersectional rivalries, but it's not always those same two teams that are playing each other in the championship game, like we've so often seen with Clemson and Alabama over the course of the last couple of years. Do you think it's good for the sport, or you think it, you think the sport suffers a little bit from it?
I mean, I'm of two minds of it. Excellence, I think, and dominance, and people chasing dominance is actually a good storyline. I sometimes this whole one team dominates. I never saw people say that the Patriots dominating the NFL was bad for the NFL. I mean, some people may have said that. I never heard that from the mainstream sports media. And clearly the NFL continued to grow in popularity. Just because the Patriots were winning a lot doesn't mean that the sport wasn't growing in popularity. But I think one danger on the other hand, so on one hand, I think dominance is, Alabama didn't get to the playoff last year. Clemson actually, you could argue, is the better program right now. I think if they obviously win this year, you'd have to argue they've superseded Alabama, but they're both 1A and 1B. Absolutely. I think that on the other hand, one danger college football could have is that it becomes too regionalized, and that it's mostly a Southeastern conference, a Southeastern, not just conference, but Southeastern Texas and Southeastern sport. Ohio State sort of helps make sure that doesn't completely happen. Notre Dame being good is probably helpful, but the West Coast, frankly, the Midwest and West Coast, there's a big concern in sort of the college football brain trust and intelligentsia that we're losing the sport's ability to be popular out West, which there's a lot of eyeballs in Los Angeles. There's a lot of eyeballs in Denver and San Francisco and places like that. Some of those places are never going to be, college football is never going to be number 1 in Los Angeles, but there is a concern. I think it's a fair concern. There's also a concern that if you're a team like a Cincinnati or a UCF, that even if you do everything right and play a tough schedule, or Boise or something like that, play a tough schedule, that you're never really going to have a chance at that Final Four. And I think that there's some level of unjustness there. And so I think if this were to continue 10 years down the road, you could have an issue. You're going to have an issue where people in the West just start to tune out more. And the Northeast has never been a big college football paradise. So the Northeast has always been kind of like they only are interested if Ohio State or Notre Dame is playing, or maybe Penn State. So, that's always been a concern. It's becoming more of a concern for a lot of people. So I think that finding a way, that's why I do think eventually they will expand the playoff, because they're going to want to find a way to be sure there's always a West Coast team that gets in, even if they get smoked every time they get in. And also give an opportunity, a real opportunity to a G5 school, because otherwise there could be real problems there.
Let's talk about that for a little bit, because you talked about, kind of the regionalization of it. And, what do you think is driving that? Because, I mean, if you remember, Oregon was good for quite a number of years. They've obviously taken a step backwards. USC won a couple of national championships back, in the 2000s.
In the aughts. Yep.
Yeah, in the aughts. Texas has a long tradition. No matter how many years in a row we're told that Texas is back, they haven't been able to, kind of put that together yet. What do you think is really driving that? Is that kind of the issue that athletic programs can't get their act together? Or you think there's something else that's kind of driving those factors in making the southeastern part of the country the real dominant football power?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the growth of the Sun Belt, and it has been incredible. People moving there, cities like Nashville, I mean, Atlanta's always been a huge city, but cities like Nashville, Houston, Dallas, East Texas growing, but Florida, Florida's exploded in growth in the last 20 years. Great talent comes out of Texas, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, incredible high school football talent because it matters the most there. And they're playing 7-on-7 year round, and they're playing high school football in Miami. They got people betting on the high school games. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but I'm just saying it's a huge deal. It's a huge deal. Even North Carolina, places like North Carolina are growing. Charlotte's exploded. So even places that were not traditional college football or high school football hotbeds are becoming that way. South Carolina, same thing. So I think that's part of what's driven that. That's why you see Jim Harbaugh at Michigan, even though he's struggled. That's why he's tried to recruit Florida probably more than he's tried to recruit Michigan, is to get the players. And so it's that's part of it. Certainly the West Coast has great talent, but there's a lot to do in California. So the kid in rural, I'm going to tell you, the kid in rural Alabama that grows up dreaming of playing high school and college football, or frankly, the kid who football, and I hate to say it that way, but that's how it ends up. Football is their way out of bad circumstances in a city like New Orleans, or in some of the areas of Florida, not even in big cities, but in rural areas. You got these really strong high school programs with great coaching. So I think that's part of it. I also think the Pac-12 had the opportunity at one point when they expanded to grab maybe a Texas or an Oklahoma, which would have been weird, but would have given them better talent. But instead, they got Colorado and Utah after a lot. That's who they ended up with, which are Utah's actually been a good program for the Pac-12, but it's not. They've made some weird choices with how they broadcast and share their product, and there's been some bad coaching hires out there on the West Coast. Oregon actually, I think, is positioned to really, they won the Rose Bowl last year, and then this year they are going to be in a big New Year's Six game, even though they didn't have a great year. Oregon, I think, still has the potential to build back more quickly into a real national power. But if USC's not good, then it's tough for the Pac-12 to be relevant. They need USC to be relevant again, and not just like good, but really good. And I don't know they have the right coach. Going to Texas needs a coach that's going to come in, and I'm stealing from another college football writer, Stephen Godfrey. They need a guy to come in like Nick Saban that said, "I'm the tip of the spear. I am the spear, and you're going to run everything through me, and we're going to get this program turned around." Texas has all the potential in the world, but they can't ever seem to get the right coach. And Herman hasn't done poorly there, but he just hasn't been able to get the whole thing pulled in the right direction. It's very soft. So all of that put together means Oklahoma's been dominant in that conference, and Oklahoma and the Southeastern Conference schools in Ohio State is kind of where we are. And so that was a long-winded answer. It's several things, but I think the fact that football matters more, high school and college football matters more in some of these areas of the country is a big factor.
One last question before we get you out of here. You've already kind of laid it out. You think it's going to be Alabama and Clemson in the title game. You've laid out some of the reasons why. I'm going to put you on the spot here. Who do you think's going to win?
Yeah, I haven't made a final decision on this. If you ask me today, I feel like Alabama finds a way to win, 48-43 or 48-40. I'm saying, I don't want to say 42, because I think the way they find a way to win is that they hold Clemson to field goals when Clemson needs touchdowns, and they score more touchdowns, and that's maybe how they find a way to win. I think whichever team can come up with 2 to 3 stops where the team doesn't get any points, maybe 3 stops in the game, is the one who wins the game. I'd feel more confident in my Alabama pick if the center that they had not gotten hurt. I'm interested to see how they play against Notre Dame with a backup center, because that's a very important position on a football team, and their center was very good. So I got to go with my team. I wouldn't put money on it, but I'd probably go with Alabama winning something like 45-41 or something like that. So I could be talked into Clemson though. So we'll see. It's going to be it's going to be quite a shoot. I think it'll be a shootout, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, those games that end up as shootouts are always fun to watch, especially when they're for something
unless you're rooting for the team that's getting shot at. But yes.
Touche. Justin Reedy, he is on Twitter at ReedyCFB for his football only post, and he writes here at the Duckpin. Justin, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year to you guys, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Brian. Have a great night.
Thanks, you too.
This has been the Duckpin Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and download